Have you ever felt like you were on the outside looking in? Like no one truly saw you, understood you, or wanted to be around you? Maybe you've walked into a room and felt invisible. Maybe the invitation stopped coming. Maybe the silence of your phone is louder than any rejection you could hear. Loneliness can feel like a deep, unshakable void, a silence that echoes in the corners of our hearts. It can creep in unexpectedly or settle in over time, making us question our worth, our place, and even our purpose. But no matter how isolating the season may feel, loneliness is not the end of the story. It's easy to believe that if we are alone, we are forgotten. That if no one calls, no one cares. That if no one reaches out, we must not matter. These are the lies that loneliness tells us, whispering that we are unseen and unheard. But the truth is, even in the moments when we feel most invisible, God sees us. He has never taken his eyes off us, and he never will. His presence does not waver when the room is empty or when the silence lingers longer than we would like. In Scripture, there are many who found themselves alone. Some were abandoned, others misunderstood, and some bore the weight of rejection. Yet over and over again, God stepped into their stories, rewriting them with love and purpose. The woman at the well went to draw water alone in the heat of the day because she was an outcast. No one walked beside her. No one called her friend. But Jesus saw her. He spoke to her when no one else would. He offered her living water, a relationship that would never run dry. Loneliness does not disqualify you from God's plan. In fact, it often becomes the very place where transformation begins. When we are stripped of distractions, we are given the gift of deeper dependence on God. It is in these quiet places that he shapes us, speaks to us, and reminds us of who we truly are. Our value is not determined by how many people surround us, but by the one who created us. Seasons of loneliness can also serve as a preparation ground. David spent years in the fields tending sheep alone before he was anointed king. Elijah hid in a cave feeling abandoned before hearing the still, small voice of God. Even Jesus withdrew to lonely places to pray, finding communion with the Father in solitude. If God is allowing you to walk through a season where you feel alone, it is not for your destruction, but for your development. He is building something within you, strengthening you, and preparing you for what is ahead. Loneliness can also be a sign that our hearts are longing for something deeper. No amount of friendships, social gatherings, or recognition can fill the space that only God was meant to occupy. Sometimes we chase relationships, seeking validation in people who were never meant to complete us. But when we turn to God, we find a love that is constant, a presence that does not fade, and a companionship that will never leave us lacking. This does not mean we were meant to walk through life alone. God created us for connection, for community, for relationships that reflect his love. But in the waiting, in the moments when those relationships are lacking, we must hold on to the truth that we are not forgotten, we are not overlooked, we are still part of a greater story, one that is unfolding even when we cannot see it. If you find yourself in a season where loneliness feels overwhelming, take heart. This is not where your story ends. The silence is not empty. It is filled with the presence of God. The waiting is not wasted. It is a time of refining. The longing is not a curse. It is an invitation to lean into the one who has always been there. You are seen, you are known, you are loved. And even in this moment, when you feel most alone, God is with you. He has a plan for you, a purpose beyond what you can imagine. Loneliness is not the final chapter. The story is still being written, and in the hands of God, it is a story filled with hope, love, and divine purpose. Rejection is one of the most painful experiences we can face. It cuts deep, leaving scars that can shape the way we see ourselves and the way we move through the world. Whether it comes from friends who walked away, family who didn't understand, opportunities that never came, or love that was never returned, rejection has a way of making us feel unworthy, unseen, and not enough. But here's the truth. Rejection does not define you. It is not a label you have to wear for the rest of your life. It is not the final word on who you are. Your worth is not based on how others treat you, but on how God sees you. And He calls you chosen, loved, and enough. Think about the stories in Scripture of those who were rejected. Joseph was rejected by his own brothers, sold into slavery and forgotten in a prison cell. Yet God never abandoned him. What others meant for harm, God turned into something greater than Joseph could have imagined. He became second in command over Egypt, not because people chose him, but because God did. David, before he was a king, was overlooked by his own family. When the prophet Samuel came looking for the next king of Israel, David wasn't even considered important enough to be in the room. But God saw him. When everyone else ignored him, God called him. Even Jesus himself experienced rejection. He was despised, mocked, and abandoned by those he came to save. He was betrayed by a close friend and denied by another. But none of it changed who he was. None of it altered his mission. He still went to the cross, still chose love, and still fulfilled the purpose set before him. Rejection will come. It is part of life, but it is not your identity. It does not change your value. It does not dictate your future. Sometimes rejection is God's protection. We may not see it in the moment, but there are doors that close because they were never meant for us. There are relationships that end because they were not built to carry us into our purpose. There are people who walk away because they were never meant to stay. And while it may hurt, while it may feel personal, it does not mean you are unworthy of love, friendship, or belonging. Your worth was never meant to be determined by people. People are flawed, fickle, and imperfect. They will let us down, misunderstand us, and sometimes leave us behind. But God is constant. He does not change. His love is not based on your performance, your social status, or your ability to be what others expect you to be. His love is unconditional, unwavering, and unshaken by the opinions of others. So if you have been rejected by friends, by family, by a job, by someone you loved, remember this: you are still chosen. You are still seen. You are still deeply loved by the one who created you. And He has a plan for your life that is not dependent on the approval of others. Rejection may feel like an ending, but in God's hands, it is often a beginning. The place where you thought you lost everything might be the very place where God is building something new. The door that closed may be making way for something greater than you ever imagined. The people who walked away may have been making space for the people who are meant to stay. Your story is not over. Your worth has never been in question, and the love of God is more than enough to heal, restore, and remind you that you are valuable, not because of who accepts you, but because of who created you. Healing begins the moment we allow ourselves to be honest. Honest with God, honest with ourselves, and honest about the pain we carry. It's easy to bury our struggles, to put on a brave face, to convince ourselves and others that we are fine. But true healing doesn't come from pretending. It comes from acknowledging what is broken so that God can restore it. Pain has a way of convincing us that we should keep it hidden. Maybe we believe that if we ignore it long enough, it will disappear. Maybe we've been taught that vulnerability is weakness. that admitting our struggles means we have failed. But the truth is, nothing can heal if it stays in the dark. Wounds don't close when they are covered up. They fester. The only way forward is to bring them into the light. Throughout Scripture, we see how God responds to those who come to him in honesty. The woman with the issue of blood had spent years suffering in silence. She had tried everything to find healing, but nothing worked. Yet, in a moment of desperate honesty, she reached out to Jesus, believing that even touching the hem of his garment would be enough. And it was, not just because of her faith, but because she was willing to acknowledge her need. She didn't hide anymore. She stepped forward. David, a man after God's own heart, was no stranger to pain. He cried out to God in the Psalms, pouring out his fears, his failures, his grief. He didn't mask his struggles. He brought them before the Lord. His honesty didn't push God away. It drew him closer. Jesus himself modeled the power of honesty. In the Garden of Gethsemane, on the night before his crucifixion, he did not hide his sorrow. He prayed with raw emotion, saying, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." He acknowledged his struggle, yet he surrendered to the Father's will. And in that moment of honesty, he found the strength to fulfill his purpose. Healing is not always instant. Sometimes it is a process, a journey of daily surrender. But that journey cannot begin unless we first acknowledge that we need healing. It requires us to let go of pride, to stop pretending we have it all together, and to trust that God can handle our brokenness. God does not expect us to be perfect. He does not ask us to have it all figured out before we come to him. He simply asks us to come just as we are, with all our wounds, all our doubts, all our fears. He is not afraid of our mess. He does not turn away from our pain. He welcomes it, and he welcomes us. If we want to be whole, we must first be willing to be real. Real about the disappointments that still weigh on our hearts. Real about the fears that keep us from moving forward. Real about the wounds that haven't healed. Because when we are honest about our pain, we make room for God's grace. When we stop hiding, we open the door for true transformation. Healing starts with honesty. And when we bring our brokenness before the one who can restore it, we will find that his love is enough. Enough to heal, enough to redeem, and enough to make all things new. Life is full of gaps, the spaces left behind by disappointment, rejection, loss, and unmet expectations. People leave, promises break, friendships fade, and the love we thought was secure sometimes slips through our fingers. These gaps can feel overwhelming, like empty spaces in our hearts that nothing seems to fill. But here's the truth. Where people fail you, God's love remains constant and unshaken. Human love, no matter how deep, is imperfect. Even the people who love us the most will fail us at times. Not because they mean to, but because they are human. They get distracted, make mistakes, and sometimes simply don't know how to love us in the way we need. It can be painful to realize that the people we count on aren't always able to be what we expect them to be. But the good news is that God is not like people. His love does not shift based on circumstances, emotions, or conditions. It is steady, unwavering, and everlasting. Scripture reminds us over and over again that God is the one who fills what is missing. When the Israelites wandered in the wilderness, lacking food and direction, God provided manna from heaven and a pillar of fire to guide them. When Elijah was exhausted and alone, feeling like he had no one left, God sent an angel to care for him and give him strength. When the disciples were fearful and uncertain, Jesus reassured them that he would never leave them. God is not unfamiliar with the gaps in our lives. He sees the empty spaces left by relationships that ended, the loneliness that lingers after a painful season, and the deep longing for connection, purpose, and security. And he steps in, not just as a temporary fix, but as the only one who can truly satisfy the soul. Sometimes we try to fill these gaps on our own. We look to people, success, distractions, or temporary comforts to numb the emptiness. But nothing in this world can fully satisfy the spaces that were meant to be filled by God. When we try to make people our source of fulfillment, we place expectations on them that they were never meant to carry. And when they fail to meet those expectations, we are left feeling even more broken. But when we allow God to be our source, our foundation, our security, our constant, then even when people fail us, we are not left empty. God's love is a love that pursues, a love that remains, a love that never fades. When others walk away, he stays. When others fail to see your worth, he calls you chosen. When others leave gaps in your heart, he fills them with his presence, his peace, and his promises. If you are feeling the ache of emptiness, if you are struggling with the weight of unmet expectations or broken relationships, take heart. God has never left your side. He is still writing your story, still holding you in his hands, still surrounding you with a love that is deeper than anything this world can offer. The gaps in your life are not the end of your story. They are spaces where God's grace can shine the brightest. Where people fail, he remains. Where love runs out, he overflows. And where you feel empty, he is ready to fill you with a love that never fades, never fails, and never lets you go. We often think of community as something we stumble upon, something that just happens naturally if we're lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. But the truth is, real friendships and meaningful relationships are not just found, they are built. They require effort, intentionality, and most importantly, vulnerability. It's easy to wish for deep connections while remaining guarded. Many of us have been hurt before, by friends who betrayed our trust, by people who walked away when we needed them most, or by relationships that never seemed to go beyond the surface. After experiencing disappointment, it can feel safer to stay isolated, to convince ourselves that we're fine on our own. But God designed us for connection, and the kind of community he calls us into is not accidental. It's cultivated. Building relationships takes effort. It requires stepping out of our comfort zones, making the first move, and being intentional about nurturing connections. It means sending the text, making the phone call, showing up when it's inconvenient, and choosing to invest in people even when it feels risky. It's easy to wait for someone else to reach out first, but sometimes God is calling us to be the one who takes that step. True community also requires vulnerability. Deep friendships aren't built on small talk. They grow in the moments when we allow ourselves to be truly seen. It's one thing to have people around us. It's another thing to let them in. Real connection happens when we're honest about our struggles, when we share our fears, when we let others see the parts of us that aren't polished or perfect. Vulnerability can feel terrifying, but it is the doorway to authentic relationships. Jesus modeled this kind of intentional connection. He didn't wait for community to come to him. He built it. He called his disciples, invited them into his life, ate with them, walked with them, and shared both his joy and sorrow with them. He could have done ministry alone, but he chose relationships, even knowing that some of those closest to him would fail him. He loved anyway, pursued anyway, invested anyway. We were not meant to do life alone. While solitude has its place, isolation is not God's design for us. There is strength in community, in having people who walk with us through both the celebrations and the struggles. But that kind of support system doesn't appear out of nowhere. It grows when we are willing to plant the seeds of connection and tend to them with care. If you feel like you don't have the friendships or support you long for, don't lose hope. Community is not something you either have or don't have. It is something you can build. Start small, reach out, be present, open your heart, and trust that as you take those steps, God is working in the process, bringing the right people into your life at the right time. Relationships will never be perfect, and they will require patience and grace. But the effort is worth it because true community is a reflection of God's love, a place where we are known, supported, and reminded that we are never truly alone. Loneliness can feel overwhelming. There are moments when the silence is deafening, when the absence of companionship feels like a weight pressing down on your soul. Whether it's the emptiness after a friendship fades, the quiet of a house that used to be full, or the ache of feeling unseen even in a crowded room, loneliness is real. But here's the truth that stands unshaken. You are never truly alone. Even in solitude, God is with you. His presence is not distant, conditional, or dependent on circumstances. It is constant, it is unwavering, and it is more than enough to sustain you. All throughout Scripture, God reassures his people of his presence. When Moses doubted his ability to lead, God said, "I will be with you." When Joshua stepped into an unknown future, God reminded him, "I will never leave you nor forsake you." When Jesus prepared to leave his disciples, he promised, "I am with you always to the very end of the age." These words were not just for them, they are for you. Feeling alone does not mean that you are alone. Emotions can be powerful, but they are not always the truth. The truth is that God is closer than your very breath. In the moments when you feel forgotten, he sees you. When you feel unheard, he listens. When you feel unloved, he wraps you in a love that no human relationship could ever replace. God's presence is not just a passive nearness. It is a source of strength. He sustains you when you feel weak. He carries you when you feel like you can't take another step. He whispers peace when your heart is troubled. Loneliness may tell you that you are abandoned, but the presence of God declares that you are held. His presence is also a source of comfort. Sometimes we chase after relationships, busyness, or distractions to try to fill the void, but no amount of human connection can replace the deep, soul-level comfort that comes from knowing God. When everything else fades, when people disappoint, when life shifts in unexpected ways, he remains steady. He is the safe place, the shelter in the storm, the one who holds us together when we feel like falling apart. Beyond comfort, God's presence is also a place of restoration. Seasons of solitude are not meant for punishment. They are often meant for growth. Some of the most profound transformations happen when we are alone with God, when we allow him to speak, to heal, and to work in us without distraction. Jesus himself sought solitude, not because he was isolated, but because he knew that being alone with the Father was where his strength was renewed. If you are in a season where loneliness feels overwhelming, take heart. This is not the end of your story. God is not only aware of your pain, he is in it with you. He is working in ways you cannot see, preparing relationships, opportunities, and new beginnings. But even before those things come, he is enough. His presence is enough. You are not forgotten. You are not forsaken. You are not unloved. You are never truly alone. Even now, in this very moment, God is with you, whispering hope, surrounding you with grace, and reminding you that his love is more than enough.